welcome again. It's Monday night here at Pine Island Research. Thank you so much for joining and choosing to spend your Monday night right here with us. We've got an exciting show tonight, talking a little bit about some of the things that we do in research out in the field that may be different at certain times of the year, especially up here in northern Minnesota, where we tend to spend 4 to 5 months a year where it reaches, well below 30 degrees and freezing. It's oftentimes 10, 20, 30 below zero, winds blowing 30, 40 mile an hour. We're not just talking about Sasquatch here. There's a lot of animals that react differently this time of year than they do the rest of the year. And my guest is from Wisconsin, and their climate and weather patterns are very similar to here. So I thought it would be an interesting conversation to have. Might not be as applicable for those who are in, Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, the Carolinas, Florida. But at the same time, there's different weather patterns that you guys follow. In the summer, when it gets extremely hot, 120, 125 degrees, high humidity, I suppose there's different patterns that you would incorporate into research and different effects that it has on data that you get in research as when it's in the 80s or 70s. So it'll be a fun discussion. We're also going to talk a little bit about my guest tonight, Dan Nedrolo's experiences that he's had out in the field. He's not one of them fellows that gets out once or twice a year on the weekend. He spends an awful lot of time in the outdoors. He does do some research also with another group of guests that we have had on recently, Randy Harrington and Shane Carpenter. Down on their property, the 400, Dan has been with them and had a chance to see a lot of the things that they're doing and work closely with them. So should be a great show. I'm not going to go through and welcome everybody by name. It takes a lot of time. Plus, for the people listening on podcast, we are out on iHeartRadio, iTunes, all of that. Every podcast platform out there, we're on. And if they're listening after the live viewing of the show here on YouTube, might get a little bit old hearing those 10 minutes of welcoming everybody by name. But I certainly don't want anybody in the chat to not feel like we don't appreciate them being here. Also tonight, feel free to put any questions that you have in all caps, and we will try to address the questions. I want the discussion to be interactive. If you've got thoughts, opinions that you'd like to share on the discussion that we're having, again, feel free to put them in chat in all caps, and we will try to pull them up on screen. So without further ado, let's bring Dan in. Hey, Dan, how are you tonight?
Okay.
Well, that's all we can hope for some days, right?
Yeah.
We're doing okay.
Doing just fine. Thanks again for taking care of me and making sure our connection's awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us. I've been wanting to get you on the show, and Randy and Scott speak highly of you. They talk a lot about the experiences that they've shared with you out in the field. And the more I learned about you, Dan, the more I realized that, you're one of those kind of guys we like to get on the show, the ones that don't sit at a computer and try to figure and answer questions. They get out in the field and put their eyes on that stuff. And we're going to be sharing some pictures tonight of some of the things that you've noticed in the areas that you spend time in. And we should start out by just saying that, me and you have had discussions at length about I think we share that same view of we pursue the Sasquatch phenomena as a flesh and blood creature that may or may not have some supernatural capabilities, but we assume in our research that we're looking at a flesh and blood individual. But when it comes to other phenomena that are out there, whether that be other cryptids, orbs, ghosts, UFOs, anything you want to cover in the paranormal spectrum, I think we're both open-minded enough to be able to not take thousands of accounts and encounters and stories and just throw them in a trash bin. There's something going on in every one of those areas. And you put it quite eloquently. You can tell me how you said it, because I can't remember verbatim, but we just simply haven't caught up with. Science might be a little bit in front of us in some of these areas.
Yeah, we definitely have a ways to go before there's a general appreciation for some of the claims that continue to be talked about, but yet not substantially proven. So,
Sure.
yes.
Sure.
But we have to keep an open mind, I presume. After all, look at where all our technology has gotten us on the verification outfit. We're still waiting and still working.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, saying so much in this technology, the tools and the things that we use in research, look at how far it's come over the years. I mean, the ability to analyze video and audio evidence compared to what it was 10, 15 years ago, I mean, is unbelievable. DNA technology is tenfold each year increasing. So, I think that we are getting more and more tools to slide into the gun belt when it comes to trying to solve and bring and move the ball forward in solving these mysteries. But for those that aren't aware, I mean, I kind of spilled the beans on, but you're from Wisconsin. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I was real interested in dinosaurs, like just about every kid. I took it a step further, became a herpetologist as fast as I could, and ended up going to UW Stevens Point for a degree in wildlife biology. One thing led to another. I ended up working with National Wildlife Federation, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, contracting as a survey biologist for all kinds of entities, from DOT to Department of the Army and Trout Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, et cetera, et cetera. My interests were primarily reptiles and amphibians, rainforests, and wildlife photography, but I've always been interested in primates, and I had my first experience probably in 7th grade that left me wondering what just happened. We had something lake edge that wouldn't come out and show itself amongst a bunch of 7th grade church campers. And it was loud. It hissed incredibly loud. And I never was able to find a vocal to match it. And when I ended up in college, one of the first problems I had was I couldn't get anybody to talk Sasquatch in any way or form with any degree of seriousness. So basically, you're working silently alone for decades in many cases, for those of us who are a little older. My mother passed away in 2000. My sister made a bet. I ended up in the BFRO for 4 years, went independent after that. And for the last 20 years, I've been looking at reports, working with witnesses, and trying to get in the field in as many states as I can, which has ranged from Florida to California to much of the Midwest and Rocky Mountains states. So I haven't found a lot of evidence, but I've found some, and I'm much better at it now than I was, several decades ago. And I want to extend my appreciation to Shane Carpenter and Randy Harrington, Gary Schutte, and the crew with Ozark Mountain Sasquatch, because they've opened up my world as well by showing me some of their methods and techniques and getting results with that.
Yep, and that plays into this idea that there are no universities handing out master's degrees in Bigfootology. I mean, we are the students and we are the professors. We learn from each other, and I think that the time that you've spent with Shane and Randy and the others that you mentioned is really a testimony to that. I mean, you've probably taught them a lot, and they've taught you a lot. So,
And we're, in a sense, just getting started. A lot to go.
yep. And the fact that you guys are willing to come on shows like this and share your experiences, share the things that you're seeing. I mean, you're teaching others, and I can't tell you how many times I've followed the discussion going on in chat, and I learned from people just watching in chat, sharing their opinions. So I honestly believe that this is the way you move the ball forward, is you communicate with each other who have that same degree of passion of solving the mystery. I mean, what one thing I find intriguing is that your first experience was when you were in seventh grade, and it's amazing how many people, when you talk to that have been spending decades researching, you say, how did it get rolling for you? How many of them it involves an encounter in those preteen, teen years, which kind of supports this idea that, I've said before, I think one of the weakest links in the chinks in the armor of Sasquatch is that it's vulnerable to its own curiosity. And I think that to some degree that probably plays true when you start seeing all these encounters that are happening with young people at that age. Maybe they're more intriguing to them. Maybe they're less threatening to them, so to speak. You think there's something to
I
that?
think you hit the ball. I think you hit the ball on the head with both curiosity and less. There's children and women certainly aren't typically as threatening as men would be. I know numerous people who have activity on their properties, and usually it's the men that haven't had any sightings at all, whereas the women and the children, in many cases, have. And it that pattern seems to continue.
Yeah. I think with humans in general, you got a human walking down a path, jogging down a path, whether they're biking down, whether they're alone or in a group, that more often than not, a Sasquatch that would see somebody coming down a path will choose that elusive MO that they have, to simply back into the woods and be unseen and just move away from that. They're trying to avoid that type of contact. But I also believe that curiosity will get the best of any species. And there's something I think that they would feel more comfortable expressing that curiosity the lower the threat level that presents itself. And when you do see women versus men walking, or younger people versus older people, maybe there's something less threatening to that scenario. I mean, in most of the cases, they've seen somebody coming that's out hunting or carrying a firearm or having dogs with them that are running, whether they're coon hunting or whatever. They're not typically 10-year-olds. I mean, they're older people like us. And so by default, maybe we just present a little bit more of a threat level just because we're older and we're men. I don't know. But it's plausible. It definitely is a plausible theory. What would you say in the areas that you look at now? You investigate different encounters. When people have an encounter and you get wind of it, or they get in contact with you, you tend to conduct an interview, go out and look at these areas, and poke your nose in a little bit. So you've seen a lot outside of just your backyard, so to speak.
Yeah, and I've covered some different states. I've done some different properties. Tennessee comes to mind. Missouri, of course. Iowa. I haven't done a lot in Illinois yet, but I'm working on a project right now. As a matter of fact, you have a photograph from with the aberrant or unusual looking face of the primate in question there.
Yeah, we're going to share that a little bit later.
Yeah. I'm extremely interested in the behavioral aspects and the repeat behavior. One of the things that came up years ago was we had a fellow who stumbled into a stream bottom in Indiana, and he wasn't crippled, but his gait wasn't typical. He had a cane, he had an injury, and he was slow moving. And it seemed interesting because when he went fishing that day, his claim was that he had a family of Sasquatches come up and literally walk right up to him and look him over from head to toe. And then after they were done, they pretty much went on their way and kind of blended back into the vegetation. So people that have possible injuries or a slowness about them also may fit into that curiosity
Sure.
situation.
I mean, they're I don't like to talk about things factually, so I have to just assume that if we're talking about an upright walking hominid who has the intellectual capacity to be near ours, if not in some areas, maybe surpass ours, you'd have to assume that they have the ability to show empathy. That it isn't just instinctive survival type, like deer and everything else, right?
Sure.
That they have families or clans, they all have roles in that clan, they rely upon each other to stay elusive, stay undiscovered, stay safe. And you would develop a lot of different feelings, so to speak, and empathy may be one of them. It almost sounds like by that gentleman's account that they were doing a physical assessment of him. Like, are you injured, or, why do you need this to aid you in walking, or why do you move differently than others? It's something is intrigued them enough to express that curiosity, it seems.
That's a good insight. It is interesting because there's so many reports along the lines of people being helped, either physically moved or perhaps maybe bad weather, and all of a sudden the man looks up, and here in the middle of the snowstorm, there's a Sasquatch actually heading in the direction that he needs to go and might not know where to go. So I've had numerous people tell me that before. We have a report out of Minnesota where a youngster got stuck in the wetlands really badly, and he was having trouble moving. And here comes a great big adult female, and she literally yanks him out and puts him on the road. Of course, a lot of this is anecdotal, and you wonder, is this really happening? But the reports continue to repeat. So it certainly brings that thought to mind.
Well, and you have to look at the motive behind if it wasn't true. If you've got a young boy who is stuck up to his knees in mud or whatever, can't move, he can make up a lot of interesting stories on how he got unstuck, but without being influenced by this community or having a threshold of exposure to what a Bigfoot is or is purported to be, to say that something 8-9 foot tall walked up and pulled you out of the mud and made it so that you could walk to get help, you kind of wonder where that would derive from in that mindset to come up with that, wouldn't you?
You would.
I mean, it just, I mean, I don't know. I know that young people are influenced by culture even more and more so these days. There's enough Stephen King movies that have been made over the last few decades. There's different things that influence them, video games, this and that. But that is a story that would be pretty hard to question as to where it derived in his head that's how he got freed from that predicament, if that's really not how it happened, But
True.
What well, let's talk about the first 5 pictures that you sent me
Yeah.
involve a lot of different forest language and some trails and stuff. And we had a discussion earlier where I had said to you, you know, I don't put a lot of stock into forest language on its own. I mean, if I'm out in the woods, doesn't matter how remote I am. You're from Wisconsin. I'm from northern Minnesota. We both have a realistic grounding of what snow load and different things can do to create some pretty crazy looking stuff out there. So when it's on its own, it's hard for me to put a lot of real hard stock into forest language. But when you start seeing it on a property that you've had vocalizations from, that you've had, you know, stuff that you're leaving get taken from, things like that. Now that forest language starts feeling a little bit more like supportive evidence more than on its own something that could have been duplicated.
I echo your comments almost exactly. Obviously, woods can be affected by trees breaking on their own, wind, rain, snow, tornadoes, windstorms, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting in this case that we have a couple of breaks that I really don't have an explanation for, but I'm not really concerned about that. But what I am interested in is the type of vocalizations that we've been able to hear come out of the location, and also its proximity to a private property that I've been spending time at for the last decade, gathering information on vocalizations and just watching things being moved. For example, a large rock brought up from the creek bottom and laid on a rock wall, or watching bricks being twisted or moved, or seeing coins picked out and put on edge, for example. So
Mm-hmm.
it kind of rules out jays and crows and foxes and squirrels.
Sure.
As I'd mentioned to you before, we had a situation back along the Wisconsin River years ago where we thought for sure we had activity with a big stump and a deer skull. And here it turns out, about 2 years into this, one night I'm coming into the nature center and here is a gray squirrel with a deer skull in its mouth, taking it right back up to the top of that stump.
So
And
you had said you guys would take this deer skull and throw it out into the woods, and
yeah,
next time you'd come back, it'd be sitting right back on the stump again.
exactly. So we thought we had a game going, but obviously not.
No, you know, and that's one of the things I appreciate about you, Dan, is that it would be so easy for somebody to come on and say, well, there you go, it proves Sasquatch is on this property. But instead you approached what you're seeing, the data that you're receiving each time you come, and said, I have to prove this not to be what I'm theorizing with the same tenacity as I am trying to prove that it is. And in doing so, you realize that a squirrel's stronger than you think it could be.
Oh, exactly. Now, what's interesting about that particular private property is it's within a couple of miles of several other BFRO reports, and I know not everybody puts a lot of stock on the reports that come out of different organizations, but collectively it gets interesting, especially when there's secondary evidence back up. In addition to that, we had a situation where the lead naturalist was on the property, came around a corner, and all of a sudden something threw a backpack out of the brush and took off running down the trail. And it was large and it was heavy and making noise. So our only option is target species or possibly a human. Well, the speed that this thing covered the ground with was so fast, by the time he got around the corner, he should have been able to see it. It was gone. It had hit the brush and was out of there. That was one incident. Another incident was one night he was working in the bottoms, and I think he was collecting willow for some projects for youth. And all of a sudden, he got a perfect bobo howl, just perfect. And his thinking was, well, I can do that. So he sounded off. And the next howl he got in return was much closer. And it was intimidating enough for him to just literally pack up and leave. And we've had wood knocks from that area. So it wasn't just the squirrel and the stump and the deer skull. We had other things in the area that were seemingly significant, although visuals, we had one visual claim, and then we had a visual claim about 3 miles away. So,
Mhm.
you know, we thought we had a lead, but obviously the squirrel won. So
Yeah. Well, and getting back to the pictures we're going to share of some of the structures and things that you've seen on the properties that you're on, again, it would be easy for you to come on and say, and I've seen this happen over and over on different channels where people say, there you go, there's proof. And that is not what's happening. It is simply you sharing some of the things that you've discovered that you find puzzling. It isn't on its own any proof that Sasquatch exists on this property. It's simply saying this is intriguing. And so I don't want anybody in chat to say, oh, well, that could have been this, that could. You're right. If you've got an idea of what it could have been, share it. We certainly aren't here to try to mislead anybody into thinking if you see this, that means there's a Sasquatch there. What makes it, what amplifies the intrigue is that this is on a property where you've had these vocalizations and where you've had these other experiences. So with that said, I'm going to pull up the first one because it looks like in a tree, you've got, I'll try to move these around. You've got, what are those, tomatoes?
we have a tomato on the bottom
Yep.
and an apple on the top.
Okay. And then you can see in the background, there are some hooped branches that are tucked, appear to be tucked under, almost like a trigger on a snare, isn't it? The way it's underneath that branch
That's
right
the
there.
general look. The emphasis of my point here is that we're looking at a base of what appears to be a break, and whether there's significance to that or not, I don't know. The significance to me is that this is an interesting place with a lot of broken trees that I don't have an explanation for, where we're getting vocalizations. And so this actually, in the last 10 days, I decided, okay, I'm going to start putting some time in here. And I've put up 6 apples so far. You're looking at the 6th one there. And 5 of the apples have all been taken. And there hasn't been any fragments. And,
and you're leaving them in areas like we see here. And, we're not on the ground where a deer is going to walk up and pick it up.
Right. I mean, the deer may well be able to hoof and get that.
Well,
but,
sure, or a bear.
Or a raccoon or any number of other species. But let's just play the game now and see what happens. So I've tried one citrus so far that was rejected. I'll try another citrus tomorrow.
I mentioned that to you. I have left citrus, like halved oranges in areas, and other than seeing some songbirds that will obviously, a lot of orioles and things like that will get on the citrus, cut citrus, but I've never had anything take a half of an orange. I mean, whether even bears and raccoons, I can't get any of those animals to take a half of an orange.
I don't want to know where you're getting your oranges from, man.
So Alex says, and this is a good example. When I said earlier, on its own, it's when you combine it with, we're hearing vocalizations or tree knocks or something there. Alex says, or repetitive tree structures. Now that's true. You could look at something like you see right here and say, well, on its own, is that really that intriguing? What happens if you start seeing 10 of them in a 1 mile stretch and they're all bent the same direction?
Right.
That gets a little more intriguing on its own. Again, not proof of anything, but
sure.
What I find interesting about this is snow load or ice load on a tree will cause enough weight to bend it over and hold it in that position. And then when it melts off or falls off, it doesn't really retract into its natural original position. That will cause things to bend into splits like you see right here in that tree. But when you see it underneath of a branch and then left there triggered, that normally would have came down and rested on top of that branch and then maybe we retrieve back. But for it to be tucked under there and pinned, that, again, on its own, not any conclusive proof, but it does make it intriguing. Like something seems to have not just bent it down to a natural stop, but tucked it under that stop. You know, and if that makes sense.
Sure.
But all right, let's see here. We've got the next picture is here. What are we looking at here, Dan?
Well, to be honest with you, what you see is what you get. The part of what I'm interested in here is we have some paths that are throughout this woodlot, and I don't have a real perfect explanation for them yet. I haven't thoroughly explored them yet, but they didn't seem to be there earlier in the year. And I brought a tracker in with me he's originally from Colorado. He was rather intrigued by everything, and he was a little confused by what was going on. We were looking for deer hooves. We were looking for deer hoof prints. We were looking for scat. We were looking for deer rubs. A little early in the year for deer rubs. So, but we haven't found anything conclusive yet. So this is basically a place to watch. And some of the general shots that I showed you were just grab shots of the forest floor to just see if any of the viewers maybe are familiar with some of the paths that we might see here.
Well, and through my experience, I spend an awful lot of time archery hunting. When I see a path and I'm walking down, let's say within 150 feet, if it's a deer that's creating the path, I'm going to find droppings, even if they aren't actively making scrapes or rubs at this moment. Rubs don't generally repair themselves. I'll see rubs that are a year old, 2 years old, along these paths. When you start traveling 100, 150 feet of a game trail and you're not seeing droppings, you're not seeing rubs, you're not seeing scrapes, anything that would, hoof prints, anything that would give you an idea of what created the path. To me, I find that intriguing just because I've been on so many game trails that it's not that hard to figure out what left it. When you start covering 100, 150 feet down a trail and you can't solve that mystery yet, to me, and I think to a lot of people in chat that spend that much time in the outdoors, to not see some sort of hard evidence as to what created the trail, that in itself can start getting pretty intriguing. But let's see here. What else do we got? Okay, this picture here I found really interesting. So you got a fairly decent sized tree that looks like towards the top it goes into a V, one's behind the other. But diagonally here on this smaller tree, you have it going what appears to be through that tree. And, if we were trying to explain this with extreme high wind events or something like that, there isn't enough structural integrity in that tree or that dead branch there to drive it through a trunk of a tree. There certainly doesn't make sense that a tree that big could have grown around a piece. They can grow around a lot of things. I've seen them grow around bikes. I've seen them grow around a lot of things. But to grow around a smaller dead piece of timber, that timber would have rotted and fallen out of the way before that tree could have grown around it. To me, that is perplexing to try to figure out how the heck that happened right there.
I thought it was worth the picture. Yes.
Yeah, it definitely is worth a picture. I'll try to zoom in on it here again. You can see this branch here matches this one on the top of these two right here. And it seems to go right through that trunk. And it's not just underneath the bark. I mean, looks like a third of the way across the diameter of the trunk. So that is interesting. I've never seen something like that before. And yet, even if we were to try to manufacture a circumstance in our heads of how Sasquatch would do that or why Sasquatch, I don't know that there is an explanation there either. I mean, this almost seems like one of those unsolvable mysteries that I can't come up with a plausible explanation for,
I'll do a little bit more on that in the future, and if I find anything more interesting, I'll let you know.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Here we've got a tree break that is obviously dead material. I mean, you can see the green leaves
mhm.
on bigger trees behind it. This is a tree that's been dead for a while. It's splintered up, not just where the break is, but coming down the stem here and coming down the stem there. It seems to be splintered. Looking at that, it almost makes you wonder, how did the tree stand in place that long before breaking? But something caused it to break. You can see this top splinter piece coming off lets you realize that when it broke, that piece was coming down this back edge here. But do you think there's anything interesting about any of the other things as far as the other branches that are piled into that, or is it just the
I
fact that it
guess
was a
I
break?
guess my view of this is I'm somewhat indifferent to all these things because what intrigues me the most is the vocalizations that I've been hearing out of this woodlot.
Yeah,
The easy access I've got to this one, so this should allow me to. I decided, after not bothering it for many years, I decided this year I better take the time to get in and just check it out. And
because that's an interesting point, because I think this is a good example that if I'm walking to one of my tree stands or I'm walking through any part of the Pine Island forest, if I was to see this, I'd probably walk right past it. I don't know that I would put any significant bearing upon what I'm seeing here as being unnatural. When you start factoring in, I've been hearing vocalizations and wood knocks both in this area. Now I have to stop and look at it. And even then, it doesn't support that this was caused by anything
oh,
other than nature. But
no claims here at
it
all.
stopped
Just
me when I see something like this. I would start paying attention to it simply
right,
because of the other things that I've had in the area. I
right.
had those other things not occurred, I might just walk right past this.
Well, not far from here, there are two walnuts about 10, probably 15 feet apart, both about 4 to 5 inches in diameter, both snapped at about the same height, looking somewhat like this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these little things catch your eye and make you go, huh, and wonder. But, you know, just part of the possible anomalies that you want to pay attention to. Now,
Yeah.
I want to see if
Alex,
if
Alex
this starts
pointed
to
out this.
change.
Alex pointed out this X right here that's
Oh yeah,
above the break.
and don't forget the one off to the right too.
Yeah, over here.
Yep.
Yeah, that's like I say, you could find channels, more than one channel that is in this community on YouTube that would say, look at this. This is proof that Sasquatch is on this property. That's not what we're doing here, but it is definitely interesting. Now, this picture here shows a good example of that trail.
Yes.
I mean, not so much just the tree that's falling here, but this is an example of what you're seeing in that trail, and you can't find droppings in those areas. You can't find rubs on any of these trees. It's just, and I've also seen game trails that are 5, 6 years old that simply just aren't used as a corridor route or an A to B route anymore by
Mhm.
that. Those trails, once they get covered in pine needles and dead leaves and thatch, that they're still there. I mean, there's still a walkway, so to speak. It just is void of evidence of what created it at that point. But this is a pretty significant trail. I mean, this looks like something that would be in a park that you'd be walking down on a nature path, other than it's got so much dead leaf material that if humans were walking down it regularly, that would almost be bare dirt through there.
Yeah.
But
I was quite surprised by the trail structures.
yeah. So let's jump into the picture that now this picture is one that why don't you give us the background on how you got it, who gave it to you, what was
Sure.
the circumstance, and then I'll zoom in and we'll start talking about what we're looking at here.
Okay. Basically, I also operate a group called Dogman Mystery. And my original thinking was simply I think I'm going to get a lot more Sasquatch reports with this because I believe a significant amount of Dogman claims are simply Sasquatch. And think about it, many of the figures claimed and seen and observed are distant. There's often a fear factor. There's a question about memory, with some of these being long distance and quite some time ago that the experience happened. Also, we've got low light, and then we have quite often a short duration of time where the individual is observed. So something can run through real quick, be seen and gone. And it's amazing how many will put a Dogman label on it. And I thought that'd be a good way
Sure.
to pick up a lot more Sasquatch reports. And I have. However, this came up, and the young lady that I'm working with had photographed this through her window. It had come up to the house and looked in the window. And the images that we have here that she's taken, and this is from Southern Illinois. And interestingly enough, back in the day when Lauren Coleman was doing a lot of things in Illinois, there was reference to baboons and elongated feet and some aberrant footprints and some talks of things that weren't exactly Sasquatch, but more with a muzzle or kind of a baboon face. And by golly, that's what it appears that we have here. Is it a
Yeah.
Sasquatch with a muzzle? Is it something else? I don't think we have enough information to say, but it could be one of the species that is targeted as a dogman.
Well, I'll zoom in on it and we'll take some closer looks at it. I can tell you out of the short time that I've spent looking at these two images, I don't really lean towards Dogman as the explanation. To me, it's either Sasquatch or it is. I tell you, the close up of it, if you would have told me that this is a baboon that you shot or an orangutan that you took a picture of at the zoo, I wouldn't have even blinked an eye. I would have said that's what it looks like. When you start talking about this woman took a picture of this outside of the window of her home, and you can see that at the top of the picture here. You can see the frame of the window. I don't know if it's
That's
her
correct.
kitchen window or whatnot. You can also see this isn't just pixelation. There is a screen that appears there that you can see
Right.
is causing a squared tic-tac-toed up and down texture over the image.
Right.
But when we zoom in on this, you have an arm here,
Yep.
you have a chest here,
Yep.
and you have a head. Now, and it appears to be squatting or sitting down. Now, people are going to say, boy, Jeff, I don't know if I can draw that from that. Well, let's look at the next image. And this is that zoomed up. There is obviously a face here.
Right.
But like you said, this is an elongated snout, almost like a baboon's face.
Correct. Correct.
I don't know that the anatomy is. Of course, I don't really. There's not a lot of threshold here for comparison as far as in this image. What does 4 foot tall look like? Is that here? Is that here? Is that here? You know, we don't really have a size comparison or anything of
No,
reference.
all I've got is what she's told me.
Yeah.
And she feels it's approximately 8 feet in height.
Okay.
And the legs are long. And
Well,
I'll let
there's
you
no
take it from
doubt
there.
that there is a shoulder here, an arm here, that this is a head. This
Yes.
is not. I will go as far to say this. This is not pareidoia.
Oh, no.
This
Oh,
is
no.
a creature sitting here.
Right.
It's whether or not it is a baboon or if it is a Sasquatch, or if somebody was to try to draw the analogy that it could be a dog man, although what I hear of people describing that as, I don't know that I'm seeing enough of those other than the elongated snout. I don't really see, the ears, or it's not standing upright at this point, the things like that.
Right. We have minimal to go on.
I
But
see no teeth or anything. But like I said, I'll tell you what, Dan, if you told me you took this picture at the zoo this afternoon, I'd say, I believe you. You start showing me this where somebody shot it out of the window of their house through their screen, and this is sitting on the property line. Now I'm stuck a little bit. I mean,
changes
it's
things, doesn't it?
almost a bigger stretch of the imagination that you have an escaped zoo animal on her property
Mm-hmm.
versus a Sasquatch or something like that. But I got to ask you, even in southern Illinois, it gets cold there.
It does.
Could a species like this that has escaped survive 12 months a year worth of elements in that area? Or, I can tell you right now, I don't think that an orangutan or a baboon in northern Minnesota could survive a northern Minnesota winter. I don't believe that.
I would just say that in southern Illinois, the chances are increased that they could.
Yeah, they could.
How well they could, whether pneumonia eventually creeps in, who knows? Also,
it still snows in
techniques for-
Chicago and it gets damn cold, but it
Oh, yeah.
isn't the same as what you get up in northern Wisconsin and
Right.
in northern Minnesota.
Right.
It's different. 40 degrees is survivable. 20 below zero isn't. I think for a
Exactly.
creature like that.
Exactly.
But
Yes.
it's intriguing. I tell you what, I'm not sure what. But I can tell you, I don't believe that to be pareidolia at all. This is something that is alive and that somebody took an image of it. And if, of course, we got to go by her word as far as a size reference, she believed
Sure.
it to be around 8 foot tall.
Sure.
But yeah, that's interesting.
It is.
And again, until you could get a lot more complex. You could say, if I don't know what kind of camera it was taken on, if I can't go there and see the property so that I can do some look out that window, see something in that tree line at that spot and judge how tall it is, I can't put any stock into the picture.
Right.
I get where people come from when they do that.
Sure. Come spring, I will visit, and I will also take some measurements, and we'll get the details on some of that.
I just know that when it comes to any picture of somebody saying this is a Bigfoot, this is a orangutan, this is a dog man, I would say that more than 9 out of 10 times, my reaction is that's pareidolia.
Mm-hmm.
And I simply can't do that. That's what makes it so damn intriguing.
Well, the only reason I brought it up was simply because of the background information that I have on it and getting to know the witness long term and getting to know the location a little bit. It's intriguing. So I simply thought I'd share it.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that we had talked about earlier is let's just go there and have the conversation that if this was a Sasquatch, could you justify how this appears to be
almost a bear snout or
muzzle. Or
right,
or is that the nose where my cursor is, and this is simply a top lip with an open mouth,
Mm-hmm.
Or is that actually the nostrils way down here? I don't. If those are the nostrils, then I would say, yeah, you've got to have something comparable to a bear snout or an elongated bottom half of the face.
Right.
But we were having a discussion earlier and not trying to justify this image in any way, but the physical descriptives that would differ if you hadn't seen other races and of people, different heredity of people, different geographical um, representations of humans around the earth. If somebody just showed you pictures and the way you would perceive, let's say, some of the facial characteristics of a flat face versus somebody who has a very protruding jawline and bulbous cheeks, or nose. Maybe even when it comes to size, somebody who looks at the Aboriginal people of 5 foot tall versus a Shaquille O'Neal at 7.5
Sure.
foot tall. I mean, you would almost look at them and say they're two different species if you didn't know any better.
Well, that's it. Which reflects here: is this a Sasquatch with a recessive characteristic with a muzzle, perhaps different ear placement? Can that be? Is that possible? What do we have for throwback genetics? There's a lot we don't know. This may or may not be something that turns out to be a key image with another species, or not. And open-minded is good, and we'll see if more things like this are collected. I'm especially interested in tracks. Track record for alleged dogmen is pretty minimal. There are some interesting things out there, but the ratio between dogman tracks and Sasquatch tracks are like 100 to 1 or even 1,000 to 1.
And
again, one would say, how many of those Sasquatch tracks are real? So there's a question with that as well. So,
well, I think that, when it comes to Sasquatch tracks, you've got people who are experts in locomotion that look at identifying a mid-tarsal break. Does a track have thermal ridges? There's a lot of things that you could probably look at and determine, not necessarily are they authentic, but are they hoaxed? I think you're able to discount many of them as hoaxes, and then the rest of them you lump into this could be authentic. I don't know that it's easy to say that anything's authentic when it's an undiscovered species when it comes to science. You don't have a body on a slab to compare it to. When it comes to Dogman, I don't know that there is anywhere near. I don't think there's, like you said, I don't think there's 1% of the library of data to compare, let's say, sample 1 to sample 10 to sample 50. I mean, it just isn't there. If I said to you, draw me a picture of what you think a Bigfoot track looks like, you could probably draw them pretty easily. And if I asked 10 people that, probably 8 or 9 of them look pretty similar. If I asked you to draw me a picture of what a Dogman track looks like, I think if 10 people did it, you'd have probably very likely not 2 of them looking very similar. I mean, there just isn't a reference for it like there is in the Bigfoot community. But yeah, it's an intriguing picture. I would love to, if you get more information on the picture or you get an opportunity to get out on location in that area and discover more data on it, I'd love to hear about it.
Go ahead and share.
Yep.
That's the plan.
Welcome to the chat, Tim. We got Tim Halloran, another one of the
Tim.
hosts on the Untold Radio Network. Tim is the author of the Bigfoot Influencers book and has a show that he does that is a great show. You guys should check it out. Anybody else, like I said at the beginning of the show, if you've got comments or anything to add to tonight's discussion, feel free to put it in all caps and throw it in the chat and we'll try to share it. So I guess that brings us back full circle to kind of this discussion of what is it that we're looking at here. I mean, when it comes to Randy and Shane down on their property, the 400, they're about ready to come forth with some interesting evidence. We shared a little bit on a past episode of a long trackway over 100 tracks that they've cast, many of them.
Yes.
And they've got a very significant audio capture that is very long and depicts multiple examples of audible communication within it. It isn't just a howl, it isn't just chatter. It's similar in the Sierra sounds, so that this audio capture that they have has all these different examples of different types of communication by more than one individual in a long audio capture. It's being analyzed. Do you remember the name of the fellow that's analyzing it? I can't remember off the top of my head.
That would be.
Is it Scott Nelson?
Scott, you got it. Scott Nelson.
So Scott Nelson took a deep dive forensically into the Sierra Sounds and interpreted over 600 syllables that are expressed throughout that entire audio capture, and is trying to take and break this sample down that Shane and Randy have, that and phonetically it break it down and draw comparisons. So let's say a minute 35, and in the Sierra Sounds, those syllables you're hearing there are the same as 5 minutes and 12 seconds into this, and show how many similarities may exist in those two audios. Because by Scott Nelson's definition, when he heard this audio capture, he said this is the most intriguing audio capture he's heard since the Sierra Sounds, because of all the different examples of communication that seem to be expressed in this capture. I can't tell you how excited I am to hear it. I know you've probably heard, maybe you've heard it by now, but I haven't.
I've
heard all of it. But
yes. I'm looking to spend some time with it as well.
Yeah. So when you look at their property, you've got these trackways, you've got these audio captures, you've got the experiences of them walking up onto one in that tall grass.
Right. I was there that night, by the way.
I'm telling you, what when you take 100 steps back and look at this, what do you think it is that we're looking at? I mean, are we looking at a creature that has evolved into these niches all over, or is it a creature that maybe has been abandoned into these niches all over as evolution moves forth and recessive traits bring, extinction to species? Is this something that's been abandoned in these areas, or is it some sort of human evolving out of a niche into these species? What's your take on it?
You're throwing a mountain of stuff at me, man.
Well, when you put biologist after your name, I have to.
I know. Okay, well, first of all, we're dealing with something with ape-like characteristics. We're dealing with something with human-like characteristics. It shows an incredible variety of phenotype or physical traits that you described quite well from comparing different types of known humans, whether it's shack-like or whether it's extremely small. We seem to have a similar type size range descriptions from Alaska to Florida to Southern California to Maine and up in through Canada. We've got the Bergman's rule with the giants in the north. We've got the shaggy long hairs in the south, or actually in the north, of course, with the colder temperatures. Just the individual variation with everything from skin color to eyes to hair color. It almost sports exactly some of the same differences that we have. So you wonder what the genetics are. And until we get that figured out, we're really stuck, because we're going to have our ape people. We're going to have our hominid people. It gets tough because there's so many interpretations on descriptions. And so we're really fortunate to have people like Alexa Evans and Sibylla Irwin to do illustrations for us. And there's so many other fine illustrators out there. We need more photography work. Hopefully you guys will be able to set the bar on what we need for game cams to work for us, instead of getting fleeting shadows and possibly part of a hand or the side of one standing to the edge. As far as my interpretations, I'm not convinced we have one species. I'm wondering if we don't have a species complex and possibly hybrids and individuals that cross. Who knows what the genetics is?
Sure.
It's an incredible mystery.
Sure. Well, for instance, I mean, not to try to oversimplify it, but if you watched a whitetail doe walk across a field and behind it a mule deer doe walks across the field, a lot of us who spend a lot of time hunting would notice a difference, but more people than not would not notice a difference. A deer is a deer is a deer.
Sure.
Two completely different species, but both walking in a similar way, approximately the same size. Head characteristics look the same. One has ears that may be 15% longer than the other. I mean, is it really enough for people to look at and say, that's a different kind of deer than that other one was? And I think you're on it. We could be on to where even if we broke down and were capable of cataloging the genetic, makeup of one of these species, we might find that a DNA sample collected in northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ohio, they all match, and all of a sudden the one from Washington State is a little bit different. Maybe they appear 90% the same, but there is a genomically different expression in that DNA. And that could make up for little things. That could make up for, we talked about earlier about the drawings that Larry Batson does and some of the illustrators that you've talked about.
Exactly.
How come one of them has 10-inch hair and the other one's really short, bristly looking hair? One has hair that's no longer than my hair. And then the next one has hair drooping down its face. It's not like one of them went to the barber and said, I'm going to grow mine out for a little while. You know what I mean? There's something, there may be little genetic glitches that are different that actually on paper would make these appear to be different species, but yet to the naked eye look pretty darn similar,
Sure. And again, remember, we're collecting so many reports in the dark, in short duration, distance problems, detail problems. So we have we're picking up a lot of behavioral things. We've got footprints, tracks. We've got numerous general things, but to get the specifics is the difficulty. And hopefully that's where the DNA eventually will come to light.
I'm going to bring this up because Libby has brought up, says it has a baby at its knee. That's something I didn't look at until she said that. It does appear that there is another face there, two eyes, and the same elongated, if those are nostrils and elongated snout, possibly another head right here. I can't say that that's conclusive in any way, but I could see where somebody could say that. I mean, she's saying it looks like there's a baby at the knee. Now, if that's all you had was a picture of that, I would say that could likely be pareidolia. You put that underneath this, and all of a sudden it's like, that could be a baby. It could be. That's a sharp eye, Libby.
A lot of obstructions in the image, but certainly the key subject is there.
Yeah. There's no doubt about that. There's definitely enough there's a discussion to be had as far as what we are looking at. But which brings us back to the whole, could we be looking at several different species that have a slight genomic difference, but overall have pretty much the same characteristics. Now, there are some things that could support theoretically, as far as people talk about the demeanor or the character, the natural characteristics of how they act. I often used to try to. I have a theory that I've can't say there's any. I can't. I'm working to disprove it as much as I am to prove it. But you know, when it comes to, and I don't want to be redundant because I've talked about this on a different show, but it maybe evolve into a different discussion with you. When it comes to up north in this part of the country, especially when you're getting into northern Michigan, northern Minnesota, Canada, you start talking about what would the apex threat be to a 9 or 10 foot tall Sasquatch, right? When you look at areas like Florida, you've got alligators, you got poisonous snakes. I mean, there's a lot of different things that you would want to avoid, but they are avoidable. If you spend 7 days a week, 365 days a year for decades, you would learn to avoid certain things and not get in a predicament like that. Up north, you start thinking, what would that apex predator be? Now, people will say mountain lions or grizzly bears, this and that. I really have a problem with either of those examples, mainly because a mountain lion, and I'm only going to get a mountain lion to pursue me is if I trigger that pursuit mode. If I see a mountain lion on a trail in front of me and I put my hands up and yell, I can tell you 999 times out of 1,000, that thing's running like hell. It does not want anything to do with a human. Now, if it's treed and it's just relaxing and I come jogging by on a trail, it's like putting a feather on a piece of fishing line and moving it in front of your sleeping house cat. It can't help.
Gotta play tag.
Instinctively, you're going to trigger a pursuit mode in that house cat. And kind of the same thing with mountain lions. Most people who found themselves in a predicament, they were jogging down a path, they were biking down a path, and here it comes running up behind them because it just couldn't help itself. That's what it's instinctively bred to do. Now, I know people who go out and mountain bike and jog and have, beanie hats with a set of eyes on the back. I have a backpack that has a set of eyes on the back of it. And people will say if a mountain lion's looking at something face on, it probably isn't going to approach it. But if it can pursue you from behind, it will follow that instinctive pursuit mode. I don't think a mountain lion would ever look at a Sasquatch and say, I want a piece of that. I just can't see that being the case. It doesn't seem plausible to me. Mountain lions also typically will not hunt in packs. They are loners. There might be 2 or 3 of them on a kill, but it typically wasn't 3 or 4 that took down a kill, like a deer or an elk, When it comes to grizzly bears, I think grizzly bears can be very, very, and polar bears can be very ferocious. But I also think that if they were to look at a 10-foot tall, 1,200-pound individual, they might say the risk isn't versus the reward. I mean, what am I going to gain out of fighting this thing? I'd just as soon walk away. The one species that I don't seem to see that in is wolves. When wolves start hunting in packs of 10, 20, 30 wolves in these large packs, they aren't afraid of anything. They aren't afraid of grizzly bears. They aren't afraid of anything. Because that number in a pack, they are collectively the apex predator in the north, in my opinion, when it comes to being a threat. And if Sasquatch was to try to avoid wolves, that's pretty hard to do. They start tracking you, they start surrounding you. It would take more than one to ward them off. Now, again, I'm having this discussion, just thinking out loud, trying to look at plausible and least likely explanations for something. But I would say that it's plausible that in the north, there could be larger clan sizes or family sizes in order to protect yourselves from those types of threats. Would there need to be large clan sizes like that against whatever you would perceive to be threats down south? I don't think there would be a need. I think 3 or 4 could survive pretty easily down south, or it might take 10 or 12 in a clan to survive collectively up in these extreme northern climates. That to me seems plausible. The only reason why I take us there in that discussion is, you know as well as I do, if you work in an office with 2 people, it's not hard to get along with 2 people. If you work in an office with 10 people, you're going to find somebody who just rubs you the wrong way. And it could be that they become more tolerant of each other in a larger clan size, where in a smaller clan size, they're more easily irritable. That could be a plausible explanation why some of these reports down south, you hear about them being aggressive and this and that. They don't need to get along with 10, 12 individuals to survive. You know, to me, that's a theory that could be plausible. That why do they seem to be less violent, less whatever up north, and whereas down south they seem to be more aggressive? You just hear, that's not rule of thumb across the board, but generally you hear that in a lot of accounts. Have you heard that on southern?
I've heard
southern
that.
accounts than northern accounts, that they're more aggressive?
I've heard that, but I've also seen plenty of people not have any problems with it. So,
Yeah.
I think so much of it's locality. Some of these bad places seem to have historical references. So, in other words, people had trouble in this area, or vehicles were damaged, or dogs were killed, or people were chased out, or that type of thing. I was going to comment on the wolves and the kitties. It's interesting when you look at actually how many cats kill people in the United States every year. It's a reduced, tiny number. Doesn't allow for all the attempts, though, where people got hurt, but it's still a small number. And if you're looking at it, wolves generally don't bother people. I know there's exceptions, especially now that there's more wolves than there were historically for the longest time. But if Sasquatches were actually hairy men, you wonder, maybe, just maybe, there's a similar type reaction between the two. I mean, these, they've been recorded as running together in some reports, whether believable or not. So there's just, I guess what I'm just saying is this all stems into so many questions.
Yeah.
And like we talked about before, how are these things surviving winter? And I just happened to spend part of the night going through some of the reports in the upper Midwest states like Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana. Very, very, very few reports in any counties between, say, November and February. There are a few, but very few. And so it's like 25-1 that you've got spring, summer, fall reports to winter reports. There's been some tracks reported. There's been some road crossings, but they so often end up, well, we didn't follow them. 1, we were scared. 2, we realized that wasn't human, so we didn't follow up. And then also, where did it go? It went into an impenetrable swamp or an impenetrable forest, or it was dark. There's always an excuse not to follow the tracks. So, but I did find the coldest temperatures that I'd found activity in were about 20 degrees below. And it's also real interesting to me that we have some very, very small human-like tracks that appear overnight, when at night it was like -1 degree or 33 degrees, and it's out in the middle of a swamp. I mean, are there people dropping their children off to run in the swamp barefoot in the middle of the night? No, not typically. So I think there's a lot of evidence right under our eyes that
well, I think there is some natural explanation as to well, for instance, in the Pine Island Forest here, northeast of Bemidji, Minnesota, and the northern, from the southern Pine Island Forest all the way up to the boundary waters and the Canadian border of Minnesota. I go out there in the middle of the summer, and most of those very remote areas are not, there's no human interaction in those areas, although it's not impossible to see that. I mean, there are designated hiking trails here and there. There are designated mountain biking trails. If I was to travel down a waterway, I might find a spot where somebody camped, or, a water bottle where somebody fished or something like that.
Sure.
I go out there in January, February, I can't find any sign of anything. I mean, there just simply are not people, even in those remote areas, that time of year. So less sightings might just be because there's less opportunities to have the sightings.
Right.
Another thing to consider is, and this is something I was talking to Doug Hychek about, is that, if I was to walk through a muddy riverbank and leave a footprint in mud, that footprint's going to be there a while before it's gone. I mean, it's going to take a big, rain event in order for that not to be captured in time on that bank. Whereas even when it's 10 below zero and windy and it's snowing, it could be that they time their movements. If they need to move or go hunt or whatever, they might wait until it's snowing with a wind.
I agree.
Because I could walk through a foot of snow with some wind, and an hour later, you will not see my tracks. They're blown in.
Right.
And so it may be more, they could actually use those elements as an advantage to cover where they've been. If it's still that night and there's no snowfall, I'm not moving. I'm fine where I'm at. Within 2-3 nights, it's windy and we're getting snow. I can go hunt wherever I want, because in 4 hours, you aren't going to tell where I was.
There you go.
So, there are some differences in how the evidence of where they've been is erased, so to speak, in certain elements and climate.
Right. That's a great point.
But I see Nikki from Harryman Hoaxes and Hoodwinks. She's got a show on YouTube. Check her channel out if you haven't. She said, "Do I know Dan? Do you know Nikki Cologne?"
Not yet.
Well, check her channel out and you will. She's got a great channel. She talks about she exposed a lot of different hoaxes, talks about a lot of things in the community that, like a good example is the new video that came out from that Tennessee area, where most people are leaning towards the fact that this is baloney, but that surfaced a week or so ago, and a lot of channels were covering. Those are the kind of things Nikki will start talking about.
Good.
I think there is a fiduciary duty we have to the community to throw the BS flag when it's warranted to throw it. And there also is a kind of a duty to try to educate each other into letting the default be, let me look at evidence and see what I can find that supports the possibility of this being authentic. But you also have to be realistic enough to just not subscribe to anything that's thrown your direction. And in too many people, that's happening too. I know Pat Turner recently took a picture of a tree line of nothing, drew a couple red circles around some possible pareidolia and put it on the sites. And there were people that were like, "Hey, great job." Like everybody gets a ribbon here, And I don't think that doesn't help the community. We need to educate each other on being able to determine what's likely real and what's likely not real, and what to look for in drawing that determination.
We would like to see a little resolution in the photography. Yes.
Yeah, that would be refreshing, wouldn't it? So Alex says he's southwest of the Pine Island Forest. Alex must be up here in Minnesota. Southwest. So that would be what? Maybe Detroit Lakes area? South of the Pine Island Forest is the Itasca State Forest, where the headwaters of the Mississippi River originate from. It's a beautiful area. And the Itasca State Forest is straight south, and a little bit west of there would be, you'd be getting into that Detroit Lakes area, maybe a little north of Detroit.
Can I bring you a fun report from Minneapolis?
Absolutely.
All right. I was in Florence County years ago driving around at night. It was after midnight. I had a radio station on, and by golly, Linda Godfrey was on. And I'm driving around looking for tracks by myself in the dark in a heavy forested county in northeastern Wisconsin. And here she is on talking about dogmen. Well, she gets a call in from a fella from Minneapolis, and he was out. It turns out he was out walking his sled dogs. He was riding. They got away from him. So now he's Mississippi side river, and it's midnight plus at night. This is his story. And he's lost his dogs. They have taken off. So he's heading their direction. And it's winter. There's snow. And he's going along, and all of a sudden, there's this large creature that steps out of the brush, doesn't even look his way. It's within 30 feet of him, crosses the path, and goes down into the river bottoms. He's left standing there thinking, well, I'm alive. I wasn't killed. And off he went to get his dogs. And, of course, his question to Linda was that a dog man? And, of course, he didn't really get a profile shot. He didn't get a good look at it. It sounds very Sasquatch to me. But here's another example of a winter active report at night in a place where you'd swear there's no way. Within city limits of a large city. So just thought I'd throw that in.
That's interesting.
So it's like they're under our nose. I've got one more report from Minneapolis area. Fellow saw tracks led under a bridge. And what he found interesting about the tracks was the apparent amount of heat from the individual leaving the tracks was going through 3 and 4 inch snow and just literally melting the snow around the tracks. And it was just a situation where here's again is another potential individual observed in a place you'd never guess.
So you're saying in the couple of seconds it takes to lay one footprint, that in that couple of seconds that foot being in contact with the snow is actually melting the snow?
That's what I was told. And I've had other people describe this as well.
That has to be pretty hot.
Yeah. But I found that very interesting that he would take the time to even talk about that. So.
Yeah, coming from somebody who has found themselves back when they were college aged, having drank too much that evening, jumping in the snow to do a naked snow angel, I can tell you melting snow isn't something with body heat, isn't something that happens very quickly.
No, exactly. Sounds like you've been there, done that.
Yeah, it's to step in something barefooted, emitting, 98.6 degrees body heat, you aren't going to melt crap in 1 foot placement. Even if you stood there for several minutes, you would melt it. So it would have to be putting off a pretty high heat signature to get that to happen. What you got? Any other? You've heard so many different accounts. What would you say is one of the most interesting ones that you've heard, and would you be able to share it?
Sure. Years ago, I from Iowa, I was quite sure that there was such a thing as Sasquatches. This is back 20 some years ago. And I had talked to a young man who was in Iowa, and he was with his group of guys, and they were walking back to town after a camping trip through a creek bottom. And I had him on the phone, and he was asking me, why can there be this giant 7 foot plus hairy man in a creek bottom so close to town and nobody knows about it? And whenever we talk about it, we just get laughed at. And I couldn't, of course, answer the question, but he had a group of others that had seen it as well. That was one of the first reports that I got that made me think these things are a lot more widely distributed than probably most know, especially that coming out of Iowa. In speaking, we've talked a little bit about their behavior regarding women and children. Here's another one. One of my favorites is from a report out of Upper Michigan. A woman was heading home. She was in Minnesota. She drove across from Minneapolis across the UP. She almost made it to the bridge to drop down into Lower Michigan, but she wasn't quite there. And she pulled over along the road to just take a rest and get some sleep. Now, it turns out that she left her window open. And when she woke up in the middle of the night, there was such a bad odor that she was convinced her 20-month-old son had messed his diaper up. So she turns the lights on and she checks it, and everything's good. She's not quite sure what's going on. She notices the youngster's intense stare out the window. So she happens to look up, and here's a Sasquatch face, inches from hers, outside the front of her little station wagon, looking down at the child. And her first reaction was death. I'm going to die. So she drops back behind the wheel of the station wagon, the steering wheel, and nothing happens. And she's watching, and it's looking at the child. It glanced at her momentarily, continued to look at the child. Then she really panicked. She realized both windows were down. She immediately got that taken care of, realized she was in a car, turned the lights on. This creature stood back, pulled its hand off the hood of the car, stood back, kind of covered its eyes a little bit, and she backed out and took off out of there. It was described as well over 7 feet tall, big, wide shoulders, and had Angora-type hair hanging from its head. It can be seen in one of the reports that I did for the BFRO in UP, Michigan. I forget the county. That was one that just intrigued me because I talked with that woman for over 5 years, and she eventually told her son about his experience. And her fear was that he wouldn't believe her, and apparently he did, which is good for family. Another report that comes to mind is in the Minnesota side across from Buffalo County in Wisconsin. The woman had noticed tracks, weird things coming from the woods, approaching her property and turning around and going back. And it was like ski tracks. In other words, whatever made them came out of the woods and had scooted its feet along in the snow to just obscure any detail in the prints.
Just shuffled as it walked.
Shuffled, yes. And John Green describes that exact same thing with there was somebody who was flying, who I believe was British Columbia, but I forget the location in Canada. And again, it was like giant ski trails that these creatures were making while they were sliding their feet in the snow. And so that's interesting. It's almost as though they are working to not leave detail behind.
Yeah. One time while snowmobiling on a trail near Itasca, Minnesota, I was running from Park Rapids up to Bemidji on a snowmobile trail. We had gotten a lot of snow that night, like 8 to 10 inches overnight. And so it was like just flying through the powder. They hadn't even groomed the trail yet. And I seen an inline track that diagonally cut across the trail from a tree line on the left side to a tree line on the right side. And I got off and looked at it. And that's what it looked like something had shuffled through the snow. You could easily pick your feet up. I mean, I walked next to it and made print left and right.
Sure.
But something had originally, and right away I thought, well, maybe somebody was cross-country skiing. But later that afternoon, I had seen a couple of people cross-country skiing. I rode over to them to really look at what they were leaving behind. And you can obviously tell when somebody's cross-country skiing. I mean, it is planked tracks left and right. There is a little bit of disturbance between them, but there is no doubt that somebody was cross-country skiing when you see that.
Right. Smooth.
And when I look back at that track, I think, well, if it was a little wider in placement or if it was a little more abstract, maybe you could say, well, it was a moose that wasn't high stepping through it, or maybe it was a bear track. But you could tell it was in line like 2 feet. It wasn't wide enough to be, hoof moose tracks or bear tracks. I mean, bear tracks from left to right usually have a pretty wide stance at where they're placing those. And it just, in retrospect, I look back at that and think, man, I wish I would have really understood what I was looking at that time, because I would have loved. I was on a snow machine. I mean, I could cover a lot of ground very quickly, and it had just stopped snowing 3, 4, 5 hours before I was out there. So, how fun would it have been just to fly along those tracks, to at least try to identify what laid them? But
Yeah.
I just, at the time, I just didn't put enough thought into, I just chalked it off too easily of, this is a natural occurrence, and didn't really think maybe I was looking at something more than that. But
Well, I think that's what happens to a tremendous number of people,
yeah,
and especially if some of these individuals are walking on, half of their foot or on the side of their foot, and probably or possibly obscuring tracks behind them, those things come to mind as well. So,
or if they're with a juvenile, they have the juvenile walking in front of them, and they're kicking up those tracks as to not,
sure,
trying to mask the fact that they're out there with something that may be slower or more.
Sure. Yep.
More
I had a landowner in Virginia, and one night it snowed. She wasn't in real good health, so she had minimal capability in running around the property to check everything. But in this case, she was able to hike down to the river a little bit, and then come back to the house, get a rest in, and then go back to the river. Well, what was really nice was, in the group that we were working with, our the 4 tracks that she would find would be 17 inches, 14 inches, 12 inches, and 7 inches. And here the 12-inch tracks walked in the footprints that she left coming back from the river. So that was kind of interesting. It makes you wonder how often they may walk in each other's tracks to minimize tracks in winter as well.
Sure. Yep. No, there's every time, and it's really a testimony that if we were to get hard facts, if we start moving the ball every time we uncover something and say we can determine this to be true, all that does is open up a whole new slew of questions. I mean, I used to joke about, geez, even if somebody dumped a body off in a Walmart parking lot of Sasquatch, we're not going to just argue whether or not they exist or not. Now we're going to argue about where they exist, how many, the whole argument just changes. There's still, the debate never ends, But right now, I'll tell you, I believe that with the tools that we have and the pace that technology is advancing, and the more people that are out there in the outdoors, that I just find it hard to believe that we're going to go another 50 years or 70 years since the Patterson Gimlin film of 70 more years of blurry video. I mean, I think that probably, especially with the advances in DNA, and that's really where I've started focusing. Our whole 2023 and 24 research projects is focused on DNA and vector collection, different things. I'm going to be talking more about it in upcoming shows.
Awesome.
We're going to have a couple DNA professors from a university in California on that aren't necessarily part of a discussion on whether or not Bigfoot is real. The question is going to be, what can we and what can't we accomplish with DNA technology? I think there's a big gap there, what people understand what's possible and what's not possible. People say, well, we could get this and test it. No, you can't. There's a lot of things you can't test. Um, Scat being one of them is probably the most unreliable thing from a living body that you could test and come up with reliable DNA that science would recognize, But skin oil samples have skin cells in them and blood and hair and saliva. These are all things that highly testable, highly accurate. As far as how you collect them, we got to get outside of the box in how we're thinking. The same thing with photos. If we just keep hanging up game cameras, are we really just repeating the same everything that's in the box? It doesn't seem to be producing results. There needs to be a concentrated effort to do something different. And I don't see it happening in a lot of areas. It could be something as simple. Matt's in the chat from Central Florida Bigfoot. Again, he's got a channel on YouTube. I would encourage everybody to check out Central Florida Bigfoot. Matt Larson. A year ago, me and Matt started talking. I was doing the research, kayaking into these areas, accessing these really hard to get to areas by kayak. And Matt said, I live down here by the Green Swamp. That seems intriguing to me. That seems like a great mode to get back into these areas where most people aren't getting. So he got a kayak and he started doing that. And he is a great photographer, great wealth of information on camera equipment. But once he started getting back in there with a kayak, then it's like, wow, let's look at ground blinds. Let's look at these things that people typically aren't talking about on their YouTube shows. This is what I'm doing. I'm not hearing people really doing some of those things. And that, I believe, is where we unlock the mystery by not simply just repeating all the same crap that is not producing results. What do you, when you go out into an area like where you have those vocalizations and stuff, are you going to start working with audio recorders and putting them out in those areas, trying to capture samples like that? I mean, I would imagine now that you've seen what the boys down on the 400 have accomplished with that audio capture. Boy, I'll tell you what, it makes me want to buy 100 Zoom audio devices and hang them all over.
It does. It does. And I've got some of that going, but I'm going to be doing a little bit more of it. Yes. And not just those areas, but other areas as well. We've got some, where I live, we've got a couple places where some tracks have come up in question that look good, and those areas need to be accessed as well. The biggest problems with a lot of these situations, there's permission from property owners.
Sure.
So that can be a fight sometimes. But
Yep.
You don't necessarily have to say the S word. And if you just work with wildlife, that may well open some doors too. So I've got about 3 new areas that I'll be investigating this winter.
Ozark Mountain Sasquatch says, yes, most are doing the same thing, expecting a different result. That is the definition of insanity. We're all going insane, repeating each other's unsuccessful techniques. But, well, what do you got coming up on your schedule? I mean, I like to end my shows with the guests talking about what they've got coming up. Do you?
I'm actually invited to Panama to do some photography work. That may happen. Other than that, my focus right now is on the Midwest, and I'll be checking in with Randy and Shane to see what the next chapter brings. And I'll be doing some more work in Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan.
I spent some time. I spent almost 60 days in Panama.
You did?
Yeah, when I was in the military. And there are a lot of primates down there, a lot of monkeys.
Oh, yeah.
We, when we were first stationed there, rather than being in the city where most of our work was done, we were staying in big GP medium tents out on the beach. It was like being on vacation. It was beautiful. Until that night, when we were sleeping, we started having rocks thrown at our tent, large rocks. And I walked outside and got hit by a rock by a monkey. And then we realized there was about 30 monkeys out there. And they were all ticked off because one of the fellows in our group had given them some food and they were not going to quit and it was just a vicious cycle. For 2 months, we kept telling each other, stop feeding these things. They're not going to let us sleep. And yet somebody kept feeding them and they kept throwing rocks at us every night.
Can you tell me what they were? Were they howlers or were they something else?
I don't, you know what? I could tell you. I'd have to do a little bit of research because I know there was more than one type there, but primarily they were all the same type. I just can't remember what species was which, but they liked fruit. They liked bananas. They liked apples. Anything you throw them with fruit, they would sit there and eat it. And you could feed them 100 pieces of fruit. And as soon as it's gone, they're throwing rocks at you again. They were just incessable when it came.
Oh, boy. That sounds like fun.
But there's not a lot of sleep to be had once you start feeding a herd of monkeys like that. But
we'll all remember that.
Well, it was fun. I mean, it was different for a kid from South Dakota who grew up in South Dakota.
Oh, yeah.
It was pretty interesting.
Sure. Speaking of South Dakota, are you getting many Sasquatch reports there?
No. Well, it's funny because, I used to think that Iowa, there was no business that Sasquatch would be in Iowa. Now, you start factoring in the Ozarks are just south of Iowa. You got Missouri, right? And you got the Ozarks, pretty forested area. And north of Iowa, the southern third of Minnesota is pretty much Iowa as far as terrain. It's farmland.
Prairie. Yep.
Once you get about a third of the way up into Minnesota, you start getting into the woods, and then the forests get thicker and thicker as you go to the Canadian border. Sure. But you've got about a 350-mile stretch from where the forest ends in Minnesota and the Ozarks begin, and that is across Iowa, right?
Right.
And although you've got river bottoms and tree, shelter belts and stands of oak trees and things like that, for the most part, it is about 90% farmland, open fields.
Right.
Why would there be Sasquatch in Iowa? But for those that will subscribe to that migration theory, would you rather be in the Ozarks come January, or would you rather be in the Pine Island forest where it's 30 degrees below zero? I don't know how many actually would migrate back and forth, but I will say this. If you could travel at 15 miles an hour for, let's say, 18 hours a day, and you hunkered down and slept 8 hours a day, you could get from the southern forests of Minnesota to the Ozarks in 7 to 10 days, probably shorter, if you kept moving when it's dark. And so I'm not going to say it's not plausible that they could do that, but I do believe a lot of Iowa sightings, it'd be hard to habituate and live in an area in Iowa for a long, sustained period of time. Now, when you get way on the east side of the state, where you start bordering, the Illinois, Wisconsin type borders, it gets a little more forested over there.
Right.
I shouldn't say forested, it's not like conifer forest, but a lot of different hilly type terrain.
Possible terrain that isn't as frequented.
But you hear about a report, like in Des Moines, Iowa, and stuff. It's like, what the hell is a Sasquatch doing in the middle of Iowa? But I'm not going to say that they don't migrate through Iowa. Just it's not that far to get from the Ozarks to Minnesota and back and forth.
4-letter word, corn.
Yeah. Once you take
it's seasonal, but at least
people don't realize you can get lost in a cornfield. And you'll go in a cornfield, you'll come to a road, cross that 30-foot roadway, and you're back into a cornfield. if you had the ability to inherently decipher what is north and what is south, you could move from Minnesota, Iowa in August before, or even September, before that corn comes out at the end of September. And you're talking 7-foot tall corn, nobody's going to see you.
Exactly. And there's a tremendous number of reports associated with cornfields. So,
yeah.
Just another factor.
No, but here in South Dakota, you know, the state's kind of interesting because the things that people would recognize South Dakota for, Mount Rushmore, the Black Hills, the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally, Deadwood in the casinos and where the gold rush was. That's on the extreme western Wyoming, South Dakota border where it is mountainous and forested. The fourth of the state heading west to there is the Badlands, which not many living things can exist in the Badlands. It's like being on a different planet. But for the most part, the central part of South Dakota and the eastern part of South Dakota aren't any different really than Iowa. You know, tall cornfield most of the summer. We do get a lot of animals displaced in South Dakota, meaning every year we have 2 or 3 instances of an adult moose running around.
Wow.
You know, in the southern southeast corner of South Dakota. I mean, we're talking 500 miles from where this moose should be. What brought it there? What made it go there? I don't know. I do think that there are some answers to be had in science that have not yet been clearly uncovered that involve reasons why animals would get displaced that badly. And a lot of them derive from, we get a lot of mountain lions here, believe it or not. And they come here from the Black Hills of western South Dakota. When an alpha male gets ran out of a territory and displaced, somehow they cross 350 miles of South Dakota, including the Missouri River that runs north and south through the middle of the state, that you've got to swim across 2 to 3 miles of water to get to the other side, which mountain lions can do. But they get displaced here in eastern South Dakota. So what the game fish and parks started doing was, rather than tranquilizing them and moving them back out west, they started putting collars on them. Let's figure out what they're doing here, which to me, that was ingenious. I mean, if you really want to figure out why they're coming here, let's figure out what they're doing while they're here, right? So they put collars on these, and there is a river called the Big Sioux River that runs north and south that's on the Minnesota-South Dakota border that runs about 150 miles long. From Sioux City, Iowa, all the way up to, you know, water of about 2/3 of the way up South Dakota. There's a river that defines the state border. And these mountain lions were setting up in that river bottom. And what they were discovering is there was a mountain lion about every 25 miles territory-wise along this area. So there's, 8, 10, 12 mountain lions there all the time. So they started collaring them. And they would see them move within those areas, but they got enough of them collared, and they'd fly over them twice a day to track where they're at. And they realized once they set up shop, they were content where they were. If there was a hog farm around, they were killing a pig now and then and whatever. But one day they flew over, and one mountain lion they were following wasn't there anymore. So they flew over that afternoon. They didn't pick him up. They flew over the next morning. They didn't pick him up. And that next evening, they got a report from a railroad in Kansas where this mountain lion had been hit by a train. And so the South Dakota GFP went down and picked this mountain lion up and did an autopsy on it. You know what they found out, Dan? that it had 3 molars that were abscessed and infected in one of its jaws. And they came to the conclusion that this thing had ran 320 miles or something like that in 48 hours.
Wow.
And that the reason why it did is if you've ever had an infected tooth before, if you stop moving and lay down, your head is pounding. I mean, ready to explode. And they can't take Tylenol or antibiotics. What they do is they start running and they get their blood pumping, and it quits hurting while they're doing that. And they'll run for hours. And then when they stop, it starts hurting again. So they start running. And they just keep doing it. And for a mountain lion to be running 30, 35 mile an hour, after it does this for a few hours, it's just disoriented. It doesn't recognize where it's at. It just keeps running. And they came to the conclusion that this thing displaced itself almost 300 miles in 48 hours because it was trying to get that tooth to stop throbbing that badly. And that's all it did to fight that, is it just kept running. To me, all of a sudden I started thinking, well, any animal could have that happen. When mountain lion's chewing on a bone of another animal and it cuts itself and gets infected or whatever, or a bear or a moose. I mean, anything could chew on something and break a tooth or get an infection to where it would feel that.
Sure.
Is it possible that that's how they alleviate that pain, by running? So get their blood pumping and it quits hurting. And then as soon as they stop, it hurts. So they start running again. Maybe that explains why a moose ends up hundreds of miles away in the middle of a cornfield where it's not supposed to be, you know?
Well, I just know that the big factor in Wisconsin is our white-tailed deer. And then you've got a brainworm that affects the moose but doesn't affect the deer. And as a result, that causes the moose to either pass away or simply, not come into the high concentration deer areas.
Yeah.
So, and we had a cat that came out from South Dakota that ran through Wisconsin. So ended up, I think, as a roadkill in Connecticut. And I think that individual had the longest distance verified so far. And that was like 1665 miles. So they're virtually any state is cougar capable, I think, at this point.
Well, for a long time, the DNR up in like New Hampshire and Maine said that there weren't mountain lions there.
Right.
And they stood by that for almost 2 decades, claiming that there weren't mountain lions there, until somebody has a game camera, a moose hunter had a game camera of a mountain lion sitting down on a rock with a big long tail with a black tip on it right in front of the camera. And finally, the DNR said, okay, we've known we've had them here for a while, but they were worried, there aren't a lot of them, right? And they were worried that had they put it out that these things existed, that people would overreact. Well, that's one of the things that the GFP told me in South Dakota, is that the one thing you'll never see is online or in a newspaper. You'll never see the South Dakota GFP claiming there's a mountain lion every 25 miles along the Big Sioux River, because people would overreact. They wouldn't let their dogs out at night. They won't let their kids play. People are just going to freak out.
Well, just imagine, if we can't handle cougars, how can we possibly handle ape men? Giant ape men.
It's going to get worse before it gets better, if that's the case.
No, the comedy and the politics, and plus the cost of managing an endangered species east of the Mississippi River, much easier to deny existence, so much easier.
Alex says Minnesota has denied large cats for years, and that it's completely bogus. I mean, it got to a point where they just couldn't anymore. Even just kayaking the Clearwater River, I had a lynx following me often.
Oh, that's cool.
It got to one time. The second time I saw it, I had thrown some perch fillets out of my freezer in my kayak, and I thought, man, if I see that again, I'm going to throw these up on the shore. But that was kind of dumb, because half the time I was kayaking into there, it was dark.
Hmm.
And one of the most unsettling sounds you'll ever in your life, is a lynx.
Oh, aren't they
It's worse than
fantastic?
a mountain lion. It's
Yes.
worse than a bobcat.
Yep.
The
There's a
the high pitched, sustained scream that they're able, and they can
yes.
hold it for like 30 seconds. It's like stupid long.
There's a
Eh,
beautiful vocal on two males just screaming at each other. It
Yeah,
goes
I've seen
from
that before.
yeah, that's a beauty. That's a
But
wonderful
you'll
example
be out there at
of
night.
them.
It's dark. You're kayaking along, and just I don't think they do it trying to scare you. It's just for whatever reason it's just a sound that they make. It's cows moo, pigs go oink, and and a lynx screams like a woman being murdered. It's just for whatever reason that's just the sound they make. But it will stop your heart and your blood will freeze up when you hear it in the dark when you aren't expecting to hear something.
Oh yeah, exactly.
But but yeah, there's quite a few lynx, I think, in the in northern Minnesota and in the peninsula of Michigan and northern
Hmm.
Wisconsin too. I mean,
We have a few, but yet it hasn't been we haven't had lynx kittens verified yet in the state
yeah,
of Wisconsin, which is interesting.
yeah, which is weird because I know they verified them like up in the Boundary Waters. They've
Yep.
verified them. Eli, Minnesota. They've verified them around International Falls, Minnesota. Lake of the Woods, which is actually in Minnesota a little ways.
Yep.
They've got all kinds of and there's guys that was their life goal, was to try to photograph lynx kittens. There was quite a few professional photographers that did this, and once one did it, it was like within a 3-year span there was 4 or 5 guys that had photographed them.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it's just
hopefully they're
crazy how
on the
something
way
can
back.
be prevalent in Minnesota and not in Wisconsin, which I know
True.
sounds crazy for most people who aren't familiar with those areas, but you go into northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota, you'd think you're in the same place. I mean, everything's the same, but it's a bunch of lakes, a bunch of thick conifer forests with birch and poplar trees. I mean, they don't look any different. I don't know how
Yeah.
something could be in one spot and not in the other, but
And snowshoes are everywhere. So
yeah,
the diet's there.
yeah. Well, I tell you, Dan, I really appreciate you joining tonight. It was fun. I want to get to a point to where uh, the boys down on the 400, when they're ready to release the audio recordings, once that's been analyzed phonetically, kind of dissected and analyzed, I want to have them back on. I'd love to have you back on when they're on. I
Sure.
think it'd be a fun show. So
That'd be awesome.
all right. Well, I
That would be
appreciate you
awesome.
joining us tonight and appreciate you bringing the pictures and sharing them and being a part of the discussion.
Well, thanks for having me.
You bet. Thank you.
Yep.
So that wraps up another show. It is 9:59 on the nose Central Time. Wanted to thank everybody for showing up in chat. I've been trying to follow along with the discussion. It was a great discussion. I always enjoy even going back sometimes and rewatching the shows, not because I want to watch the show. The last thing I want to do is spend more time looking at my face, but just following along with what you guys are talking about. It's intriguing. And you guys chose to spend your Monday night with us, and we appreciate that. We'll be back with a great show next Monday night. I think you'll enjoy the guest. Until then, you guys take it easy. Be careful. It's getting cold here. It's been about, in the 60s, 50s, overnight lows and touching 30. But come this weekend, Friday, the high on Friday here is 30 degrees. So, the seasons are changing. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk a little bit about cold weather research tonight. Is literally in probably 2 weeks, we're going to be covered in snow up here. But it's a fun show. Thanks for showing up. You guys take it easy, and we will see you later.